Thinking Aloud, conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to be exploring Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. For those of you who may not know, Anton LaVey wrote a best-selling book called The Satanic Bible and was the founder of the Church of Satan in San Francisco. In fact, I used to live nearby. My guest is Carl Abrahamsson. I'll be speaking to him from his home in Stockholm, Sweden. He is a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. He is what you would call a magico-anthropologist, as well as a filmmaker, photographer, and musician, and he is active in the magical community. His most recent book is called Occulture, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. He is also the publisher of the annual anthology of occulture called The Fenris Wolf. In addition, he has published Resonances, an anthology of his essays, lectures, and interviews. His most recent documentary film is entitled Anton LaVey, Into the Devil's Den. Some of his other film titles include Cinemagician, Conversations with Kenneth Anger, and Lunacy, a film praising the lunar forces and witches from all times and spaces. And also, Poems Are Living Things. Of course, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Carl. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's wonderful to be here in this actual virtual sphere.
Yes, you're many, many thousands of miles away from me, and I'm delighted to be able to have a instant conversation with you. It almost feels like you're in the same room with me. And I have to say, it's probably good to let our viewers know right at the outset that I feel a kind of compatibility with you because you've had a lifelong interest in the esoteric and the occult, as I have. You've had a connection to Anton LaVey and his Church of Satan, and I've had not nearly as much of a connection as you, but I've met some of those people and lived in the same neighborhood as the Church of Satan itself in San Francisco. So I have a good feeling about them, actually, probably because as a resident of San Francisco always prided itself on being a congenial home for oddball characters. And Anton LaVey met that definition to the hilt.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, it's also, I don't know really what the situation is like now in San Francisco. We were there, my wife and I, in last autumn, and it was quite shocking to see the kind of deterioration in a way, because there were simply so many homeless people. I've never seen that amount of people living on the streets. And it was quite a shock because when I started going to San Francisco in the late 80s, that was, of course, taking care of my romanticism and, of course, getting to meet LaVey and many other people also in San Francisco. And it was like a hotspot of creativity and still open-mindedness, carrying on in this tradition from the 60s in a way. So I always lived in that kind of it was a real situation. It was a very cool and groovy place to be. And then I returned, as decades passed in a way. But this last trip, or this most recent trip, was kind of depressing because I could feel none of that. It was either glitzy corporate or very, very destitute.
Well, I think it's the impact of the high-tech industry. Housing prices have gone through the roof in the San Francisco Bay Area. I used to live in a rented house that when I lived there in the 80s, I think they wanted to sell for $500,000. Today it's worth about $4 million, I understand. It's made it impossible for people to afford housing. It's changed the character completely since I moved out of San Francisco and the Bay Area entirely in 2001. So I know it's changed dramatically. But back to Anton LaVey. Let's talk about how your interest in the Church of Satan began.
Right. I think what happens if you are, when you're a teenager, you're of course hungry for information that sort of resonates. And at that period in life, you want some kind of a little bit of a rebel energy. And that takes different kinds of expressions because, different strokes for different folks. I became very interested in the occult on one side and let's call it transgressive art, or it could be B-movies or great experimental music, anything that sort of went against the grain. And even within this supposedly free-spirited world of occultism, historical occultism or contemporary one, there was still kind of a prejudice present against LaVey and his Church of Satan, and that of course appealed to me. But at the same time, these were different times, and even in Stockholm, where I grew up, there were a couple of occult bookstores, and they carried the Satanic Bible. So I was thrilled, and I got it, and I did feel that resonance, mostly because his approach was different. There was some old stuff in there. I'm thinking of the Enochian keys and classical arcane stuff, but it was sort of presented in a new way. So I did feel that resonance, and I started to work with Satan as a symbol in a way, as a force that existed within me, and it was sort of it's specific. Every environment, every group dynamic, every society, every culture needs Satan. It needs some kind of opposer, some kind of liberating force, something that goes against, something that provokes. And of course, when you're a teenager, that's a pretty good symbol to use. So in the midst of my sponginess of sort of taking in a lot of highbrow, low-life culture in a way, I felt a strong resonance. And then I also did music. Which was also a classical thing to do. When you're interested in music, you want to try your hand at it. So I did. I started a band called White Stains. And as I was also more or less in love with Jane Mansfield, as LaVey had been, or at least had a fling with, I wrote a song called Sweet Jane, just like the Lou Reed song, about Jane Mansfield's relationship with LaVey, because I thought that was cool. And it still is. And basically, another friend of mine said, when the record came out, it was our first record, so I was very, very proud. And Sweet Jane was the A side of this single. And my friend in England, Genesis Peorage, said that you should send this to Anton LaVey. I'm sure he would find it, interesting at least. I knew he didn't like rock and roll. But anyway, I had the address and I did send it, and I didn't expect anything to happen, basically. However, something did happen. He sent me a very nice, polite letter back, thanking, sort of acknowledging the fact that I'd done this, and being grateful for keeping Jane's, spirit alive in a way. Just all around pleasant, polite letter, in which he also made me a member of the Church of Satan, because that was kind of his shtick. People he met were either celebrities or people he liked. He sort of handed them a membership card saying, here, you should have this. And that was great. I was, of course, overjoyed. And then about, I would say, a year later, I got the letter in 1988, and we kept in touch via, letters and stuff. And I had started my occultural fanzine, the Fenris Wolf, and LaVey let me use some older writings that he had in the Cloven Hoof, their newsletter, and that was fantastic. And anyway, in 1989, it became the time for me to actually go to California, and of course, I wanted to meet him and Blanche Barton, and just see San Francisco and many other people. And it was, of course, like I wouldn't say a childhood dream. It was a teenage dream that became a reality. And we really got along well, and it was fantastic. And then up until 1993, I went there every year. And we hung out and we watched movies and listening to him play music, and we talked about many, many things. Very few of these things were actually occult in the old school way of seeing it, as having to do with arcane approaches to magic, for instance. It was mostly about weird movies. Marx Brothers, Eddie Cantor, great comedies, Ben Hecht, Golden Age Hollywood, basically, and the weirder aspects of that. Plus music, of course. He was just a musical genius and could play almost anything that you wanted him to play. He was like, he had everything in his mind and could just sort of project it out through his fingers onto the keyboards. That was really magical. So that's basically how it started.
We ought to clarify one thing right off the bat, because in a previous video I mentioned offhand the Church of Satan in San Francisco, and I got a comment from a viewer who was shocked. How could you talk about them? Don't you know that these people commit ritual murders? So what can you say about that?
That's, of course, such a classical reactive way that is steeped in a kind of a primitive lore, a primitive mythology that's, of course, been propagated by various Christian churches along the millennia. There's always this need of scapegoating. And in a chaotic time in which organized religion is sort of seemingly losing its power, then, of course, the need for a scapegoat of that particular nature, meaning the Satanic, becomes again something valid and valuable. And let's keep in mind that LaVey also wrote, even in the Satanic Bible, which came out in 1969, that Satan is the greatest supporter of the church in a way, because without him there wouldn't be any church. They need someone to threaten with, to scare. It's like kind of a medieval approach. You keep the peasants as serfs, basically, by telling them that if you don't pay these taxes that you cannot afford to pay, then this gobbledygook monster will come and eat your kids. It's the same thing over and over. And also in various group dynamics of a more primitive nature, it's the same thing in all cultures. There's always this thing, the other, the threat of the other coming to take your kids, and of course eat them. Very few cannibals cannibal cultures have actually existed on planet Earth, but there's always that thing. So I would say, the Church of Satan was a construction. It was based on LaVey's very, very genuine interest in magic and occultism, because he had this thing called the Magic Circle before the Church of Satan even began, where he talked about his interests, a small group of like-minded people at the Black House in San Francisco. And then what I mean by construction, he constructed a church and wrote a Bible that in itself is kind of, audacious in a way. But that turned out to be a great, business trick or a marketing trick. But there was always substance in it. It wasn't just like a gimmick. It wasn't a ploy to attract negative attention that could be turned into something profitable. There was substance there in the let's call it the occult sense, carrying on in a libertarian tradition, individualistic tradition, a magic that sort of sides with the dark side, which was psychologically very savvy. LaVey was very interested in psychology and of Freud and Reich, and also Jung's talk about the shadow. All of these things were consciously present in the construction of the Church of Satan. And LaVey's take on this was to never try to restrain too much, but to actually indulge in the things that constitute yourself as a human being, meaning you are a feral beast. You have these sexual passions and this lust for life. And of course, you need to restrain that, perhaps in the sense of a law or legislation or the greater totality of society as such. But on a personal, individual level, you should basically do what you feel is good for you. So in that sense, carrying on from Crowley, carrying on from Rabelais, carrying on from many more or less enlightened people in occult history.
It sort of reminds me of the phrase I think Nietzsche popularized about the Dionysian culture.
Yeah, absolutely. However, there is a proviso there, is that it was, and it still is, totally okay to be Apollonian, to stick with the Nietzschean thing. Dionysian, you think that, well, that's all good. I'll revel in the sensual. I'll revel in the physical and the sexual. However, if you want to be a nerdy little Apollonian, that's totally fine too, because it's all about the indulgence that is true to your core, true to your inner core, true to your inner, the being, the core being. So that said, I think there was, of course, obviously a lot of Nietzsche, but you can always backtrack even further and stick with Schopenhauer. This will thing in Western culture, Western philosophy, and Western society basically has never been, better synthesized than in Schopenhauer. So Nietzsche took it onwards, and then a lot of occult people at the turn of the previous century took that over, integrating it in what used to be called, fittingly enough, a Luciferian philosophy, to tie it in with that kind of rebellious spirit. Or it used to be called also Promethean, meaning Prometheus stealing the fire from Mount Olympus to share it with people. And I think the LaVeyan philosophy, the Church of Satan and his later writings and all of this together is Luciferian in that sense. It's rebellious, but it's not necessarily rebelling against anything else than what restricts you. It's not necessarily a counter movement to an all-round general hypocrisy. It's more like, to each his own. And if someone is trying to sort of oppose me by saying what you're doing is wrong, then, I should probably counteract and say that you're also wrong. And it turns into a little sandbox thing, or it could become a great intellectual sparring match, whatever, or even a conflict, who knows. But the thing is, it's not necessary to take it beyond that personal level, because life is short. Our life can be potentially very, very, very good and nice and interesting. And it's not about isolating yourself as a solitary unit. LaVey used to say that Satanists are born, not made, meaning that they have this inherent outsidership. But most outsiders know that it's always in relation to, I guess, the greater insider thing. You can never really isolate yourself, even at times you want to, or it would be very nice. You are still part of a greater totality of society or a community. And you have to play along with certain basic things. But if you do that and you show people respect, they will very likely show you the respect that you feel you earn, and you can be in your splendid isolation. I like that expression, splendid isolation. I think that sums up very much what LaVeyan Satanism is about. You should cultivate what really makes you unique, and whether or not you want to show that or share it with others, that's besides the point. There are many flamboyant Satanists, but there are also many Satanists from whom we'll never hear a squeak.
You, in your documentary, make an offhand remark that there are other Satanists who were quite critical of LaVey. They felt he was too much of a showman, that he didn't represent authentic Satanism at all, according to them.
Right. That's something that you could take that to a greater group dynamic level and transgenerational levels. There will always be a little clique that sort of critiques or criticizes what's been in the past, the revolution, and then the new ones come, and then they in turn become conservative and then become reactionary, and then someone new comes in and takes over. you could see that in occult history so many times. It's almost more like a rule than an exception. It always happens, and eventually things are sort of dissolved in chaos and personal conflicts and scandals. But it's usually just like little storms in a water glass if you look at it from above. With LaVey, though, I think the thing is that what he achieved, which is very, very rare. He achieved success. And I mean that specifically on the material level. It was a pretty grand lifestyle. Crowley, he inherited some money, but he spent that money. He was kind of a pauper, actually, the last decades of his life. Whereas LaVey, when he got this thing going, it seemed to be a good, successful thing, which was, of course, completely in line, without shame. Without any shame whatsoever. He wanted it to be a commercial success, and it turned out to be one. And of course, if you feel that you are, the true Satanist or the whatever, and you sit on your little chamber and you feel that you are more in touch, you have a more thorough and true transmission, both in and out. And you see this guy who's just like in every magazine, on TV, on radio, lots of naked women at his house, and the book is selling, then of course you feel, I don't know. I was going to say miniculed. I don't know if that's a word, miniculed. I think, feeling lesser because of the fact that there's not this kind of outer reflection. What you say, if you have signal, should go out, and it should be a clear signal to people. LaVey had that. He really called his approach. Then, of course, as soon as anyone is financially successful, there will be people, criticizing that. That goes for musicians. I grew up in this thing called, punk and new wave and post-punk. And there was always this thing, it became ridiculous. Some artists were so talented and they went on to actually make money from their music, lo and behold. And then the thing was that people always said, well, he's pretty good, but I only like the first single. Meaning you can only validate and appreciate someone's work if it's destined to go nowhere. And I think that's it's a very basic human trait. In not wishing people ill necessarily, but being a bit jealous and envious of people's success.
Well, let's talk about the occult aspects of the Church of Satan. For one thing, I understand that a very important part of the religion was participation in ritual activity and a psychological, maybe even parapsychological understanding of the potency of ritual.
Absolutely. And here we come to LaVey and his church as a kind of intersection that's very interesting because if you look at it traditionally, you had all of these groups working in for instance, the so-called Western ceremonial tradition, like the Golden Dawn or the Crowley groups, or who basically took on a kind of a heritage from Freemasonic sources. There was so much symbolism, and there was sort of incomprehensible things. Why are we doing this? Why are we reenacting this Egyptian mystery? People don't really question that kind of stuff. They just go into it, head first, and maybe it works for them, maybe it doesn't. Well, I think the difference here with LaVey was that he expressly, he formulated what it was for him. Ritual is psychodrama, and you can fill that psychodramatic principle with symbols that are relevant for you, not necessarily what the elders or the top brass or what someone else has constructed for you in the hope that it will make you stay a paying member of the group in question. For LaVey, it was much more of a real tense, electrifying experiences in which you wove in things that were really relevant for instance, the transformation that you want to achieve for real. tangibly, for real in your own life or the group or for the group. So that said, there was again this kind of psychological awareness of what ritual actually does, and ritual as initiation, not just as some kind of theater in a lodge, but initiation as a moving yourself on to a new level of understanding of yourself. So I think that's the main thing that he brought to that table. He brought things to many tables. There was a division in the Church of Satan between, as stated in the Satanic Bible, of lesser magic, so-called, and greater magic, so-called. Lesser magic is this thing which was kind of anathema to talk about in these more highbrow occult circles, meaning affecting real, material, tangible change in life. And you could equate that with some kind of different facets of manipulation. I want this to happen. How do I manipulate my surroundings into making that happen? That was unheard of, that someone was so frank and willing to talk about these things in such a, I would say, honest way, and again, psychologically savvy. And the greater magic, that was more what you could call occult, elaborate rituals calling on forces that LaVey would say are not exterior tangible forces. Everything was psychological. These things, these names, these cultural, religious traditions that we've been brought up with, they affect us on an inner psychological level. You can work with those things too by, again, these psychodramatic things like wands or swords and bells. And as we know, he liked to have nude altars, to have naked ladies on his altar, to create a change, a tension in that sphere, which he called the ritual chamber. He called it very intelligently, it's an intellectual decompression chamber. And I find that so brilliant, because most of the magicians, so-called, that I have met in the Western tradition, at least, they are intellectuals first and foremost, and they have a hard time with getting to that point where you have to let go in order to shake something else, both within you and outside of you. And for LaVey to call the ritual space, the temple, if you will, to call it an intellectual decompression chamber was brilliant. One of many, many brilliant things that I found in his writings. So then later on, there has been this, it's not a debate, but there's been like pro and contra. Did he believe in magic? Did he not believe in magic? Some people say that no, he was a strict materialist and he liked to manipulate things. By Crowley's definition, you could say that that's magic too. But I'm not sure. I think that what confuses things a little bit was that he was never interested after the first phase in the grand dramatic orchestration of like arcane magic, the sort of the those kinds of gimmicks. He early on created his own magic, and that's the best you can ever do. Meaning, he took things that resonated with him in his life. For instance, first and foremost, the music. He worked with music, playing music, performing music as ritual. It didn't matter whether there was anyone there to listen to what he played when he played it. It could equally well be him alone in his kitchen where he had like 10 synthesizers. He could hammer away and play and release that kind of emotion that needs to be released in a ritual situation for it to become really, really effective. That's also something that he brought to the table. Brilliant. He talked openly about the need for emotion. I have never found that in there's not much of that in the Western ceremonial tradition. It's all about system. It's about rigid systems that you have to sort of overcome. And then when you're at the pinnacle, what is it actually that you're looking down upon? Well, you have your medals, you have your funny hats, but there's really nothing to show for it. So LaVey brought in these very important concepts like emotion and said that you can work with the arcane, with the traditional, but it's better to find your own language. And of course, not everybody is an artist. So it's not sort of excluding people who are not creative. Everybody can be creative. Everybody has things that they feel resonant with. And those are the things that one should work with. It's never for show. It's for generating an emotional transcendence in a moment where something is expressed.
Well, that would almost make him comparable to the Eastern mystics who talk so much about transcendence as the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. There is, of course, the main dividing line. You know, the mystics, their thing is to go further and further inwards to sort of reveal. I don't know, it becomes moralistic when I say to reveal how pointless it is. Life is not pointless, but the Eastern approach is always to sort of pluck the flower and get to the jewel in the lotus, so to speak, instead of adding things that you feel are fun and cool and satisfying, which was more like, you know, LaVey's magical approach, meaning you create change so that gives you more satisfaction in a way. And again, that kind of blatant, honest description of how things function in the human mind, according to him, that was new. It was revelatory for someone to use. Again, it's a language and a terminology that's basically more related to self-help books in a way. What do you want to achieve? Do this. You know, so it's supposed to be. It should be tied in with real, tangible results. He wanted that for people, and I felt when we talked about things like that he was genuine about that. But he also stressed very much that you can't get it wholesale. You have to work with it on your own terms, with your own symbols.
Now, you have written an essay comparing Aleister Crowley to Rudolf Steiner, two very different characters in the magical universe. How would you rank LaVey with those two figures?
I would rank him as a modern figure, and I would rank the Steiner and Crowley as bridge characters. They bridged the old and the modern, but they never really became modern. And I think they, in a way, what do you call it? When you run so fast towards the finishing line, but you run so fast that you stumble. They never really made it. They never really made it to the finishing line. So they were good bridge people for sure, and both excellent synthesizing. Steiner had his theosophical thing, and of course other people in that environment had synthesized before him, but he just made a great concoction. I have a great respect for him and his work. Same thing with Crowley. Crowley was the penultimate synthesizer. Brilliant, truly brilliant. But LaVey was a genuinely modern magician, occultist, philosopher, whatever you want to call him, in the sense that he was rooted in the now. There was no romantic longing. There was no need to integrate, antiquity or the Greek pantheon or anything having to do with Mediterranean culture of 2,000 years ago. It was something here and now, and he of course reacted in a way to the hippies and the sort of wishy-washy things, because the ideals of that stem from the hippie movement hadn't really been crystallized. It was all a little bit infused by chemical intoxication. Later on, it fused and crystallized into other more substantial things. But he, of course, he didn't like that. He liked sort of that people were, they should be free, but they should also be responsible. He liked that they could choose between this and that without any overarching morals, but he didn't like it to be a self-effacing thing. He liked the self. He wanted people to be strong in their identities and characters, and to fully enjoy themselves, with or without others.
When I watched your documentary and saw some of the old videos of LaVey, for example, appearing with his cape on the Joe Pine show, which I used to watch when I was a young person, Here's what it reminded me of. The Broadway musical Damn Yankees, in which the devil appears almost in identical garb, at least the way it was portrayed in the local community theater in the town where I grew up. And my parents were all involved in Damn Yankees. And it's almost as if he's drawing from a great deal from the pop culture of the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. Even further back, I'd say 30s and 40s, because he was first and foremost he was a musician, but he was also a movie buff. He was like one of the finest movie buffs I've ever met, and he was born in 1930, so anything from like age 15 and up to 25, I'd say it really shapes you as a person. So we're looking at here someone who was shaped between 1945 and 1955, and it was such a great time in American cultural history, with Hollywood going from no longer in the golden age of these hyperstars, but going into the territory of film noir. Smaller productions, aesthetically very stark and dark, integrating the anti-hero in a way that had never happened before. Those were the things that sort of gelled later on, taking on the satanic, the symbol of Satan as a kind of an anti-hero. So he was completely immersed in songs of the era. And he, in his magical work, he was also a bit of I guess you could call it a musicologist or a musical archaeologist. He got sheet music even from the 20s, from the teens, and played those songs because he believed that there was power in things that had been discarded by the collective, discarded by normality. He felt that there was an occult power in that he could use when he played those songs that hadn't basically been played for decades. And many of, he found, maybe consciously, maybe not, he found many things that were connected to the devil thematically, that kind of thing. And of course, it happened also in mainstream films that the devil was always present. I'm thinking of one beautiful director called Archie Mayo that we talked about, and I watched some of his films. There's one called what's it called? Angel on My Shoulder. Basically, when the devil has to come up to us, and it's not a good scene. So there's this thing where the devil is not necessarily something, of course, not medieval, horrible, grotesque monster. It's more of this refined, sophisticated, satirical agent that sometimes nudges people along in a kind of a loving way, but most often just pressing where it hurts. If a culture or society is imbued with, corruption and hypocrisy, there needs to be a satanic figure that pops up and says, hey, what did you just do? Don't you know it's illegal to accept these, bribes, whatever? And I think that was around in popular culture in America at the time when he grew up. So he sort of, immersed himself in that too. And the theatrics, he had, worked at a circus and sideshows. He knew that kind of carnival worker showmanship, how that worked, how to grab someone's attention by just these few tricks, having like plastic horns. And people in serious, so-called serious occultism ask, how can he expect to be taken seriously when he dresses like that and when he uses such like cheap gimmicks? But the thing is that he used, and I think someone says that in the film also, is that this word or term bullshit detector. When you act crazy like that go against the grain of what should be serious occultism and appear on TV, and again you have an amount of success, then of course you will be thought of as someone who is not serious. But again, if you are a serious occultist, you will be spending half of your life in discussion with people who want to either go, in opposition, say, how can you believe that? How can that? Meaning kind of pseudo-serious discourse. Or you could wear these things and lose 90% of the people because they will never approach you because they think you're just another showman. However, there will be people who see through this, who can pass the bullshit detector test. And with those people, you can have substantial conversations. And I think that's what he was after. It was many layers to that. He wanted to grab the attention, and he used media brilliantly, but he also wanted to get in touch with people who could see through it, who could see through the gimmicks and have some serious work with those people.
What you're describing reminds me of the time I was in Mexico City at a conference on demonology. This is where I met Peter Gilmore, the high priest of the Church of Satan, and Carla LaVey, Anton LaVey's daughter, were there as speakers at the conference. And I actually had a devil costume, and I came to the podium wearing it. And I introduced my talk by saying, well, everybody here is talking about demons, but I'm the real one. And so I gave my lecture as if I was the devil himself. It went over quite well, actually. But the point I made at the time was that the devil is like the ancient Greek god Pan with the cloven hoofs.
Yes. Very much so.
Who is a nature deity and close to nature. And whereas our modern Christian culture has this idea of dominating nature rather than living in harmony with it. And so that one finds in Satanism or demon worship of any kind, a sort of, on the one hand, being closer to nature, on the other hand, a critique of some of the hypocrisy in modern culture. And I think there's a third element that deserves mention, which is, the great work about Satan in Western literature is Milton's Paradise Lost. And Milton wrote this as a devout Christian attempting to explain Satan from a Christian perspective as the archdemon who opposed the rule of God. And since that time, every critic that I'm aware of in Renaissance literature says that inadvertently Milton turned Satan into a heroic figure, not what would be the opposite of a heroic figure.
Anti-heroic, perhaps. Yeah, no, but absolutely, you're completely right, and I think that we are also inherently prejudiced when we talk about these things because we grow up in a culture that is essentially dualistic in nature because we live in monotheism, and monotheism contains dualism. It's either or, it's God or the devil. But the human psyche is much more dynamic and versatile and needs more options. That's why, pantheism or polytheism I would argue is a lot healthier than monotheistic cultures because you have this thing where there is always a trickster in the polytheistic pantheon, because it's all a reflection of our own psyche, and we have all of these elements within us. It's not only that we are God when we feel that we're doing the right thing, or then the devil tempts us. That's such a crude simplification that creates fatigue of the human mind and the human psyche. So you need to look at the entire palette, the bouquet of different forces, which could range from really, high, lofty morals and philosophical speculations down to nitty-gritty, crude, sometimes even cruel sexual behavior. And then, of course, all the things in between that constitute the psyche of a human being. So I think that you're mentioning Pan, for instance, that's exactly where the devil figure in Christianity came from. This unrestrained libidinal force that shocked people, scared the ladies, and yet was so revered because it was also so tightly connected with fertility. And we have now become so abstracted in our lifestyles and in our cultures and in our the places where we live that we have lost touch with that. But it's just our civilization, what we live in, even monotheistic attitudes, it's a varnish that you could easily scrape off. Situations of war, for instance, show that time and time again, mostly for bad. But the thing is that if you simplify too much, then you will be completely lost. Because you will. It's an enforced schizophrenia in a way, where there's just either this that's good or that's bad. But we have a much fuller range than that to live with, and I guess that's what most people actually do. That's a funny comment in the film too. Is that I can't remember ad verbatim what. The person says, but it's just like Satanism is this thing where people live by Satanism every day, but they'll never admit it.
Well, Carl Abrahamsson, this has been a delightful conversation. I'm so pleased to introduce you to the new Thinking Aloud audience. And I'm also delighted to share with our viewers that we hope to have you back often, as a matter of fact.
I would love that very much.
So thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was great, and I'll be happy to come back. And there's always plenty of things to discuss.
And for those of you viewing, thank you for being with us.